Thanks very much, Mr Acting Deputy Chair, and I'll also acknowledge that that you played a role in this inquiry on behalf of the Coalition that actually traversed, I think, every state and lasted for more than a year. I'd like to put, on behalf of the Australian Greens, my thanks on the record to the Secretary and staff, particularly Dr Turner and Dr Kathleen Dermody, who and the secretarial staff, without whom we simply cannot do this kind of work. There are a couple of witnesses that I'd also like to specifically acknowledge. If you can imagine being called before a Senate inquiry into an issue that affects as many people as housing affordability, just after you'd had your funding cut and asked to provide the kind of essential advice and advocacy that you had been doing on a shoestring of a budget. So particularly to Carol Crochet and Eddie Burke from the Community Housing Federation of Australia, Adrian Pisarski and all those at National Shelter, and Glenda and her wonderful staff at Homelessness Australia. These are the most eminent experts and compassionate problem solvers in the country in their field, and they were giving us evidence on what the consequences would be, as Senator McLucas identified in her contribution, of axing their funding. Now, Mr Hockey, having introduced his task force after fobbing the entire country off for more than a year on this inquiry that the federal government was meant to be undertaking, has then shoved it under the rug of the tax white paper and the reform of the federation, as though people who are homeless or people who are suffering extraordinary rates of skyrocketing rents and basically a generation that's given up on ever being able to own its own home, that unless we solve a century's worth of disputes over the function and form of the federation, that nobody's going to lift a finger to help. And after what I thought were quite constructive contributions from everybody, including coalition senators, who, while we, collectively we bring very different perspectives to bear, at least the quality of debate and questions that were put to witnesses were, I thought, very high. It's extremely disappointing to then see the government minority report effectively dismissing out of hand 3/4 of the recommendations on the basis that it's red tape. If you're so keen on operating the Commonwealth of Australia as though it's a corporation, effectively just sacking people and abolishing things, go back to the private sector, because actually government is necessary for some things, and there'd be very cold comfort for those homeless in our community who are forced to go through another winter with nothing on the table. However, again, my acknowledgement and thanks to those witnesses who nonetheless, despite hearing the fact that they were going to need to wind up those entities that I mentioned before, who nonetheless actually had the grace to come and give us the benefit of their advice. There are a couple of witnesses in particular, and again we heard from a really wide range of experts and practitioners, whether it be academics, advocates, or those in the private sector or non-profits for that matter, whose job it is to try and provide affordable housing. But a couple in particular came to mind in the West Australian hearing that we conducted. A number of people who are currently experiencing homelessness actually came and gave evidence to the inquiry for the first time. It was immensely moving, and it's good to see that some of the recommendations that they put forward have actually been taken up and I believe agreed unanimously. So to Jonathan Shapiro, to Owen, Bevan and Mort, what extraordinary courage and dignity they brought to the table to tell a bunch of senators and staff who all had homes to go to after the conclusion of the inquiry what it is like to actually suffer and experience homelessness. And the description that they made is that once you fall off the bottom of the ladder, you suddenly realise that a bunch of the bottom rungs are missing. And that is why it is so important that the Commonwealth actually step up and accept its responsibility. Because the states in Western Australia, my home state, the housing department there actually has a decent reputation nationally for embedding good programs, for homelessness in particular. Just opened the new Foyer Centre in Leederville, which is effectively a way of getting people who are at risk of homelessness or actually suffering it, particularly young people, putting them into a safe environment, a roof over their head and a stable place to live, and then wrapping services around them, including job training, support and the kind of assistance that people need when they are suffering homelessness. It's devastating to hear from these people directly and realise that the single most important reason why many of them are on the streets is that their homes aren't safe and that they are suffering domestic violence or intimate partner violence, and that that's the reason that they're there. And it is not good enough for then the government to step back and say, no, we're in the business of reducing red tape. And that is one of the reasons why the bottom rungs on the ladder are missing. So to those individuals who gave evidence, and also a shout out to Nick, good on you for looking after your dad. These people have brought extraordinary dignity to the task, and it is absolutely up to us in this place to listen to them and then to carry out some of the things that they have proposed to us. And what really strikes me, I guess, about this report is that we have had report after report, not just out of this place, but across the affordable housing sector for years, describing the meltdown in the Australian housing market as a crisis, as something beyond crisis. It's the largest single component of the cost of living, and yet the government seems to pretend that it's really not the Commonwealth's problem and that the states and territories can fix it up. They simply do not have a broad enough tax base to do so, and that's why we have made some recommendations that go to things like stamp duty and reform of the state's perilously narrow tax base. This is a report that contains answers. Of course, we couldn't get agreement on everything. We've also submitted some additional comments that propose, for example, that the Commonwealth develop an interest in mandatory standards for affordable housing in particular areas, inclusionary zoning as it's known. That is something that we believe is essential, that shouldn't have been left out of the majority report. And similarly to some of the comments that Senator McLucas made about tax, we have to finally confront the elephant in the room. I think it's quite positive that Mr Bowen, on behalf of the opposition, has indeed, I think, taken a tentative entree into the debate on behalf of the Australian Labor Party on those tax measures that basically tilt the housing market in favour of investors and substantially and systematically disadvantage first home buyers. There is no question at all that first home buyers are being priced out of the market. They're being bid out of the market by housing investors supported by incredibly generous tax breaks, including negative gearing and capital gains tax exemptions. That shouldn't be controversial. So to see Mr Hockey simply, without even contemplating it, without even asking Treasury to do any modelling, Treasury told us they didn't even know what these tax breaks cost the taxpayer. We're fortunate that others and independent analysts have developed some models, and it costs the average taxpayer billions and billions, or the taxpayers collectively billions of dollars. Recommendations that were supported by the coalition, and these are the areas that we would look forward to working with you in the brief time you have left as government. Things like regeneration of urban corridors. So rather than considering that new housing supply has to always be on the fringe and that the only affordable housing that we can provide for people needs to be dozens of kilometres away from jobs and schools and public transport. Actually delighted that the coalition senators have supported that recommendation. Housing supply bonds was another one, supporting the possibility of a specialised instrument to get institutional investors into the affordable housing space. We think that that is an extremely productive idea, and a lot of work has been done on that. And a number of other recommendations the coalition senators supported. We're very disappointed that you didn't come and join the majority report, but I thank you on behalf of the Australian Greens for at least identifying the areas where you're amenable to working with the crossbenchers and the opposition. The reason why I point out that it is absolutely essential that we deal with the elephant in the room, which is the tax concessions, is simply a very, I think, a very powerful set of arguments around inequality in Australia. The fact that the top 20% of people have 5 times more income than the bottom 20%, and we have an income tax system that is designed to offset that. We have a progressive income tax system to deal with that fivefold imbalance between the top 20% of Australians and the bottom 20%. But the fact is, the top 20% hold 71 times more wealth, and that's because wealth is so generously, concessionally dealt with under our tax system, that we are taking human shelter, which is a human right, and converting it into just another asset class, and that is what has manifested this extraordinary concentration of wealth in the Australian community. I don't think it is part of the Australian culture to do so, and it's something that we think on budget night in particular there could have been some good news for people suffering skyrocketing rents and people who have just about given up on buying their own home, and most significantly, people tonight who have nowhere to go. Those are the people that we'll be letting down tonight if we refuse to take these issues on head-on, and the Greens are ready to negotiate with anybody in that regard.